I don't even know how to start these things. I have just like, wait a second. We need to like come up with a like, oh, hi, I'm Adrian Fonseca. And
You're the tech guy here. You're the one who interviews everybody and their mom.
everyone and their mom.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, I was like, okay, so we need like to like, oh, welcome to, and have a little intro kind of thing.
Or like the church militant mic'd up. We interrupt this program to bring you the special news broadcast.
Maybe not like that.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news broadcast.
Yeah, I don't know if we can qualify what we're doing as news.
It's not news.
Okay, so today I think we wanted to talk about why tradition appeals to the youth.
Which we are.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm 21 and you're
23.
There you go. So we're pretty young, and I just turned 21 literally a month ago.
And I turned 21 2.5 years ago.
Actually, I turned 21 literally a month ago. My birthday was March 5th. So
Wow.
Nice. Yeah.
Happy birthday in a month.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think we wanted to share with our friends over here what our faith experience is.
Sarcasm again.
And so if would you like to tell, you want to talk about your faith journey a little bit?
Yes. Yeah. So today, like Adrian said, we're talking about why tradition appeals to the youth, again, which we are youth. And just to share a little bit of my experience. So I have a degree in music, and my first experience with tradition came within the context of music. So my choral professor in college was a high church Anglican. If you don't know what that means, there are some Anglicans who, beginning with like Blessed John Henry Newman in the 1800s, when the Anglican Church started to become more Catholic in liturgy and in flavor, because they saw compatibility between like the doctrines of the Council of Trent and Anglicanism. So it started to become more Catholic in flavor. So the result is that today you have many Anglicans who think they're Catholic, but of course they don't accept the Pope. So we know that they're not. But nevertheless, you can find many good people in that brand of Anglicanism. And so my professor, as I was saying, is a high church Anglican. And I was given the opportunity before I even began college, when I had already auditioned and been accepted to the music school, I was given the opportunity to sing in his church choir, which is one of the best church choirs in all of town. And we were doing an evensong, which is the Anglican version of Vespers. So it's Vespers plus Compline smashed together. So you'll have a Magnificat and a Nunc Dimittis, the Canticle of Mary and the Canticle of Simeon, as well as psalms, readings, an anthem, a couple of hymns. It's an not ancient, but it's 400, 500 years old. It's a beautiful tradition. But at the end, any of you who pray the Liturgy of the Hours will know that at the end of the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis and the Psalms, you say, "The glory be to the Father, the Gloria Patri." And so I remember thinking, but I had never been exposed to Liturgy of the Hours before. I remember thinking, when we got to that part in the particular setting of the Magnificat that we were singing, I thought, hold on. Glory be to the Father. Catholics, we say this, don't we? And of course, the answer is yes. And I just remember thinking, this music is so dignified and so beautiful, and they've set the words of Mary, the Mother of God, who we believe to be, as Catholics, we believe to be immaculately conceived, forever virgin, and the Theotokos, the God-bearer. They've set these words to such beautiful music, and they don't even believe the same things about her. I was so scandalized, and I thought, I grew up with all kinds of just happy clappy hippy dippy stuff.
Wait, so you're saying that it's not dignified for the Mother of God to sing "Hail, Holy Queen above"?
Enthroned above, oh Marie. That's a good hymn if it's not done like Sister Act. No, if it's not done like Sister Act.
We can all start clapping and have all the sisters come out and start dancing down the aisles.
And why don't they dress up as priests while they're at it? But I was really scandalized, and I thought these people don't even believe the same thing about Mary as Catholics do, and yet they do a much better job of honoring her. And you'll find this also. I had the opportunity to sing for a Sunday service at this particular church. You'll find this also in the Eucharist. Their music and their liturgy often reflects a more accurate Eucharistic theology than what you find in a lot of Catholic churches. For example, they sang one time. I think I sang William Byrd's setting of the Ave Verum Corpus, Byrd was a Catholic. Yes, he was English, but he was a Catholic. And I thought, man, these people are singing our music. I was so scandalized.
Yeah, where's our patrimony at?
Our patrimony was flushed down the toilet after Vatican II. But so that was my first real run-in with tradition, and it led me to explore more traditional Catholic music because I knew that these composers were Catholic. Then led me to Gregorian chant. I was able to sing in the Gregorian chant schola in college, and it led me to eventually, I think in my junior year, attend my first traditional Latin Mass, and it was all downhill from there.
Wow. So a quick question. And so now that you are where you're at, how often do you actually attend the Tridentine Mass?
I attend it on average, at least I'd say twice a month.
Yeah. So you mostly attend what, the Novus Ordo, and
so I work at a parish that is part of the personal ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter as a musician. And so that's where I'm at on Sundays. So, and if you don't know about them, you should definitely check out their liturgy. It's very beautiful, very close to the traditional Mass. But then I attend my Novus Ordo parish for daily Mass, at least 2 days a week.
Yeah, so that's the other thing I noticed. Most traditional Catholics will also attend a Novus Ordo Mass and not have a problem with it. But the opposite is not usually true.
I mean, we do have problems.
Well, right. Problems with it, but not like, oh my gosh, Novus Ordo Mass is not a real Mass.
But the opposite, like you said, the opposite is not necessarily
it's
true.
So violent in the other direction.
Yes, exactly.
Which we'll talk about later.
People who love tradition also, because they realize that the church is, what's the word, indefectible, that it cannot stray. They realize that the Novus Ordo is still valid. There's a lot of problems with it, but it's still valid. But the opposite is not true. People who are virulently, we might say, to the left in the church, they won't touch the traditional Mass with a 10-foot pole, at least, on first reaction.
Yeah, I was reading an article from American Magazine by a Jesuit priest, an older Jesuit priest who was he grew up with the Tridentine Mass, and his article was basically, oh yeah, I remember whenever I was growing up, I wanted to try to see if I could still remember how the Tridentine Mass was. So I went to a Tridentine Mass for the first time since my childhood, and he writes about his experience, and then he's like, yeah, it was terrible. Oh my gosh, I would never have celebrated Mass like this, and he kept on railing against it. And I'm like, you don't hear people that are like in love with the Trinity Mass say, I would never go to a Novus Ordo Mass. That's just
you
not
do. You do. Not that they would never go to it, but that they really avoid it. But you're right. It's not that same kind of with people that you're talking about. There's an idea that there's something inherently wrong, evil, with the Tridentine Mass. That it represents a different religion, and And I would argue that people on the other side of the spectrum, people who attend the traditional mass and who love it, while they may avoid the Novus Ordo and go to the traditional mass more often, they don't have the same kind of violent reaction to the Novus Ordo.
Yeah.
As the other way around.
And so,
unless you're talking about like, some people who are more hardcore, like SSPXers, or obviously sedevacantists, but they're another story.
maybe we can talk about sedevacantists.
Yeah, sure. Why don't, if you're done with me, why don't you go ahead and share your first experience with tradition?
Yeah, I will absolutely share my faith experience with you. I actually don't have a problem with these buzzwords. I think they all have they have a meaning, and if we use them correctly, there's not a problem. I think it's just that they've been hijacked. If you're not
sure what we're talking about, go watch Taylor Marshall's video on Novus Ordo buzzwords.
Yeah.
It's quite funny.
Okay, so my faith journey. So I was like I said last time, I grew up in a kind of a live teen. Well, not kind of. It was a very live teen experience where we had clapping at mass. We had guitars and drums, and it was super exciting. I loved it. I was so into it. But I realized. Well, okay. Looking back, I realized. So I won't say that yet. It was probably back when I was in. So my freshman year at the University of St. Thomas, I had a few people who would come up to me and tell me about like, oh yeah, they talk about how they had problems with the mass, but they didn't like this, that, or the other. They didn't like this music at mass. They didn't like doing this at mass. And I was like, okay, whatever. Y'all rigid. And so I was super not into tradition in the liturgical sense. I've always been theologically sound, but liturgically speaking, I felt like that was wrong. Yeah.
And you grew up praying the rosary?
Yeah, I grew up praying the rosary every day. Yeah. We grew up, I studied, for some reason, I was always really into reading the saints and things like that. So I never really read modern theology. It was all just reading lives of the saints and things like that, which is great. And so, yeah, I never had that problem. I never, and then I saw how people talked about the mass, and how the saints talked about the mass. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what they mean. But I didn't realize that the mass that I was attending, the mass that I grew up with, is not the same mass that the saints grew up with. Not even like modern saints like Mother Teresa. She was born in like 1920 or 1910. So she grew up with the Latin Mass. Yeah. John Paul II, he grew up with the Latin Mass.
Yep.
And so, yeah, Benedict XVI, he grew up with the Latin Mass. All these people, and looking back, I'm like, what on earth? And so fast forwarding a little bit, sophomore year, I took Latin. And
well, just real quick, that's why the traditional mass is also called the Mass of the Saints, because almost all the saints, or the saints we have in the Western Church, all grew up with that mass or some variation that's very close to it.
Yeah, because
now, we have the East too, which they're a different story, but
right, yeah, because the Tridentine Mass, we call it the Tridentine because it's typically we refer to it as coming from the Council of Trent, right. But that's not exactly true. The Tridentine Mass existed before the Council of Trent. In fact, it's dated as early as around the 300-400s.
I've heard like 6th century. Right?
Really?
Yeah, Gregory the Great.
See, I've heard that it actually predates that.
Okay. Well, there are various uses like the Gallican, they're the Mozarabic, the Ambrosian, which is still in use in Milan, but it was codified by Pius V, Saint Pius V, in 1570, and so the traditional missal is also called the Missal of Pius V, the Missal of 1570, and it codified all these various uses, these various rites that were in circulation around Europe. So.
Yeah, anyway, so my point with that was that the saints from like the early church all the way to 1960 whatever 62 67
69
was that was the Mass of the Saints.
Yeah.
So yeah, but anyway, so
sophomore year,
yeah, right. Two things that happened sophomore year. One, I took a class with this professor, Dr. Rebard, who studied under Peter Kreeft. And he would start off class every day by praying the Come Holy Spirit, but he would pray it in Latin. And I was very intrigued by that. And I would go talk to him after his class a lot of times to talk about different things relating to metaphysics, because that was a class we were taking.
He never did that with my class.
Really?
No.
Wow. Well, he would do that every time. And one time he invited me to go to the Latin Mass, and I was like, I don't know about that. I don't think I'll do that. And so he kept inviting me every now and then. And
same with me, actually.
Really?
It was him that got me into it.
Wow.
Yeah.
We should tell him that.
Yeah, I don't think he knows.
Yeah, I don't think he knows either.
Mhm.
But I finally went one time, and it was a low mass, and I went, and I was like sitting there. People, we were 15 minutes into mass until I realized that we had already started mass. I was like, what?
Hey, it's understandable.
I was like, what is the priest doing up there? Is he like setting up for mass? I was trying to figure out what he was doing, and I was so confused. And
so
then
to get a visual perspective, you guys should look up on YouTube a video of a low mass so you can kind of understand what we're talking about.
or go to
It's
one.
Very different, or go to one. That works too. It's very different.
Yeah,
And
it's
it's a lot of silence.
yeah. If you're your first time you go, it's definitely going to be a different experience, and you're going to be very confused.
Yeah, very confused.
But that's okay. Just watch and pay attention, see what's
Watch.
going on.
Let the mystery wash over you.
Absolutely. And so I, after a while, I
wanna talk
realized
about a
that we were
faith
starting.
experience.
Yeah, I know, right?
Goodness.
And so I just started just copying Dr. Rebard, who was sitting in front of me. So he was sitting there at mass, and I was like, okay, I'll just do what he's doing. So I just started copying him. And after mass was over, I was like, I will never do this again. I was like, this was the absolute worst thing ever. I was like, it's confusing. I have no idea what's being said. The things that I could hear, which everything was whispered, things I could hear was in Latin. I didn't know Latin. And I was like, I have the missal here, and I can't even figure out where we're at in the missal. I was like, this is terrible. And then me and you were talking about one day after Latin class.
Yeah, like 3 days.
Yeah.
A bunch of days.
And you were just talking about it. I was like, no, man, I'm not about that. Not about that life. And you were like, oh, come on, Adrian. Oh. And I was like, no, Max, I'm sorry. I can't do that. And fast forward, I started going to mass at this church, Annunciation.
Oldest Catholic church in use in Houston.
Right. And it is it's a beautiful church.
Mhm.
If you ever come to Houston, you got to come visit. But I started going to the Latin Novus Ordo Mass because it was the readings are in English, and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll give it Latin a little bit of a try again.
Which if you don't know, the new mass, the Mass of Paul VI, the Novus Ordo, can be celebrated in Latin. The typical form is in Latin. So really, it should be celebrated in Latin. So that's what he's talking about.
Yeah. So the mass is said in Latin, and it's really nice. It's just like the Novus Ordo Mass, because it is the Novus Ordo Mass, except that it's translated to Latin. So I could follow along. I knew what was going on. Everything made sense to me. And then one day, so I started discerning the priesthood. And one of my priests told me, the vocation director for the archdiocese was telling me, you need to serve at mass. I was like, have you ever served at mass before? I was like, no, I haven't served at mass since I was like 7. And then I quit after day 1. And so they contacted Father Paul, who was my pastor at Annunciation. He was like, okay, well, how do you feel about being trained in Latin Mass? I was like, okay, cool. That's what mass I go to. Whenever he said that, he was referring to the Tridentine Mass.
Yep.
When I said that, I was referring to Latin Novus Ordo Mass. So he's like, so we're talking, and I basically signed up for it. And then he was like, okay, 8 a.m. And I was like, 8 a.m. What? Mass is at 11. And so I started showing up, and I was like, okay, fine. Well, I already committed, so let's do this. And so he would have me sit in choir, and I started sitting in choir. And it was beautiful.
Which means just sitting there and not doing anything.
Right.
But you're up in the sanctuary with a cassock and surplice.
Yes. And so I just started sitting up there for about 2 or 3 times. and it was absolutely gorgeous. And I was like, this is amazing. And then I felt offended by the fact that I've never been seen this before.
Now you were going. These were high masses, right?
Yes, this was a high mass.
Okay, high mass meaning with singing and incense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the great thing about it was I've always been attracted to Gregorian chant and things like that. I used to like listen to it and when I was doing homework and things like that. And then I loved it because it's usually used in soundtracks of movies, and I was like, oh, that's so cool.
Or Halo.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, are you kidding me? Secular
Wars.
movies uses Gregorian
Star Wars
chant.
has the Dies Irae in it.
It's crazy. I was like, this is like, why are we using like our Catholic
Why are we
heritage
singing Gather
in
Us In?
secular movies?
Why are we singing Gather Us In when we could be singing all this other stuff?
It's like secular movies understand
Yes.
the gravitas of,
Yes.
of the music, and we want to sing "Go Make a Difference." It's crazy. And so finding out this really moved me. And so that's how I ended up where I'm at, where now I serve at the Trinity Mass every Sunday. And I actually serve now. I don't just sit there. So it's pretty cool. I love it. So there's a thing you wanted to talk about that came up. There was a letter sent out to a traditional priest in Australia.
Well, before we get to that, we're running a little short on time. Maybe I'd like to just point out one thing off of what you just said. So when Adrian was talking about how secular movies understand our Catholic heritage better than we do with the use of Gregorian chant, and they recognize beauty. I mean, think about it. When you watch a movie, they don't pick, when they're trying to depict a Catholic church, they don't pick those churches in the round.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That you see today. They pick, the most beautiful ones, like St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. In a similar way, there was in the 60s an association of writers who were not Catholic. I think some of them were, but not
I know
all
exactly
of them.
what you're talking about.
Yep, but not all of them were Catholic. Some of them, I think, were even atheists, but they were just writers and people about town who understood culture, and they wrote a letter to the Vatican asking them to restore the traditional Latin Mass because of its value because it was the Mass that built Western civilization.
Mm-hmm.
The Christian Europe, anyways, and they realized the value of it apart from faith. So I just thought that was interesting, and among them was Agatha Christie, an English writer. So that's something interesting that you all should check more about.
So let's conclude with this instead of talking about that, because that's a whole tangent we could talk about for like. So let's talk about for the next 10 minutes.
So I mean, if you don't mind, then one other thing I wanted to mention was that not only is it, it's not just about the Mass,
right? So why does tradition appeal to the youth? Like, it's not just the Mass; it's everything that follows that. So, for instance, I was thinking the longing that the youth have today, and which is the reason why we have so many people so militant about politics and things like that, because people are looking for a common home, a vessel for culture, a common language, a common culture, a common tradition, and a common community, and they find that in politics, but that's not where it's supposed to be at.
Right. They have to be. We're looking to be grounded in something, and because the world around us today is really very unstable. With now even gender is a choice you make. Now, I mean, there's just so many choices that people they don't know it, but they're longing for solid.
They're looking for
foundations,
truth.
right? Truth. The
Fulton
capital T
Sheen said that truth is very limiting on your freedom, because once you have truth, you can no longer believe something that's false.
Exactly.
So it's like his example he used is, once you know the year that Shakespeare was born and died, you can no longer believe that he was born and died at a different date.
Exactly.
So the truth is limiting.
Exactly.
So
it's really simple. And But as we were saying, it's not just about the Mass. It starts with the Mass because the Mass is the church's most public form of prayer, as Sacrosanctum Concilium Vatican II document says. And now we'll get into that later. It wasn't necessarily Vatican II that messed things up, but it was the so-called spirit of Vatican II,
which doesn't exist.
which is dead now, right? But the Mass is the source and summit of our faith, and it's the most public form of prayer. So that's where everything sort of flows from. And the liturgy generally, the work of the church, flows from, and it finds its fulfillment in the liturgy, so that includes all 7 sacraments plus the liturgy of the hours, but most fully in the Eucharist. But things other sort of ways of life that I'm thinking of that the traditional Catholicism engenders is, for example, not eating meat on any Friday ever.
Right. Yeah.
Not just during Lent.
I started doing that.
Me too.
Yeah. And it's difficult, but it's liberating because it is difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I was looking at stats, and it was looking at how there's a huge swath of people converting to Islam, and the reason why they're converting to Islam is because they find it hardcore.
Because it's hardcore. Because it requires something of you.
Yeah, it's asking.
It doesn't cater
a lot
to you,
and
that's what traditional Catholicism does.
And the funny thing was, the Catholic Church used to call the Muslim fast weak. Because our fast was way more intense.
Right. Who was that? Was it one of the church fathers?
Yeah, it was.
Like John Cassian or something?
It wasn't one of the church fathers, but it was one of the early saints, because the church fathers pretty much were all dead by the time Islam rose.
Right.
Yeah. Saint John Damascus was the last church father that was alive during that time period.
That would forget I ever said that.
But yeah. So it's crazy. But the patrimony that we have it's still on the canon law. It has never been abrogated.
Yeah, so actually,
we fast every Friday.
Well, the new code of canon law says abstain from meat or use another penitential practice.
An equal
penitential practice. Exactly. Yeah.
And praying one rosary is not equal, I don't think.
No. And you should be doing that every day.
Maybe if you decided to fast completely instead, maybe that would be
sure.
equal.
Yeah. I mean,
depending on what the fast is.
But the point is that the purpose of not eating meat on Fridays is to commemorate the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ. And why? Someone tell me who thought it was a good idea to take that off the books, or to discourage that. Right.
Yeah, because the Thomas Aquinas did a treatise explaining why meat, and he was talking about
why
how
no meat, right?
Yeah, right. Why no meat? Why not no fish? Or why no nice meals?
Yeah.
Because the point was being made that what if you live in a place where meat really doesn't, you don't really eat a lot of meat, it's more like a fish thing. Right. Or what if you'd like to go get lobster? It's like, okay, well, I mean, you're not fulfilling the spirit of the requirement.
That's why I kind of have an issue with fish fries. Because Lenten fish fries, because okay, we're having this big meal, of good food, and that defeats the purpose of.
So this is what my point was going to be. It was that you're violating the spirit of the abstinence,
right?
And but even if you violate the spirit of it, the fact that you're following the letter of the law is actually more important, because the fact that we give up meat is referring to the meat of Christ, the flesh of Christ that was crucified for us on Good Friday.
Sure.
And we're commemorating that. So even if you violate the spirit of it by going at least the very legalistic of no meat, you are still recognizing that reality.
You are, and that is a good thing. But it's not an either or. I think it should be. I think it's both, that you can't eat no meat and then have like a seafood fest, right?
Yeah.
And gorge yourself. So, well, what's another thing? One thing I can think of is the rosary. Now, I know you said you grew up praying it, but I didn't learn how to pray the rosary till I was like in 7th grade.
Really?
Yeah. And I know a bunch of Catholics who, like Dr. Edward Sri, for example. Do you know him?
Yeah.
From the Augustine Institute.
Yeah, Augustine Institute, that's right.
He tells a story where, this is, I guess, in the late 90s. I think he was a convert. I could be wrong. But he was coming home from work, went into a church and started praying a rosary. And the lady walked up to him and said, "Oh, don't you know Father said we don't do that anymore? That old
What?
superstition." Yeah.
That's crazy.
And I know many people who think it, and I even grew up with that prejudice, thinking like, well, what the heck is this? This is strange.
That's
And-
absurd.
Right. So I really felt robbed by, not growing up praying that, but now I love it.
Yeah, in my community, because I grew up at a Mexican parish, we had like 2 English masses.
I had a Catholic community.
Yeah, we had a Catholic community. Actually, we didn't call ourselves a Catholic community, which was one good thing. But
But now it's called Catholic community.
yeah, I know. Well, no. You're referring to Saint.
Oh,
never mind. Yeah,
yeah,
a different
okay.
church. I was at a
Okay,
different church
gotcha.
at that time.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so the now they had they had like 2 English masses, and so we would only go to the English mass because we only know English. My parents know Spanish, but I don't, and my siblings don't. And so but everybody there were Mexican, Hispanic. We had that common heritage, and part of that common heritage was Our Lady of Guadalupe, and so having the rosary was just a part of life.
Yeah.
And so the fact that someone could grow up in the Catholic Church and not have that's absurd.
Yeah.
I think Father Don Calloway is the one who said,
Oh yeah.
since the rosary has been given to Saint Dominic, there has not been a saint who has not prayed the rosary daily.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that's absurd.
What's another thing you can think of?
Holidays.
Holidays such as
Holidays meaning holy days.
Oh, you mean like observance of the calendar?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that's completely been like disregarded. Like we follow secular calendars completely. Like we don't even acknowledge.
Right.
And like what do? We celebrate St. Patrick's Day by engorging ourselves with alcohol.
And green beer.
We celebrate Mardi Gras by having crazy parades and sexual license. We completely disregard all these Catholic holidays. Halloween. What do we do with Halloween?
Right. Well, right. Or even like I think an observance of the liturgical calendar. Most people don't follow it.
Oh yeah, like sec two. What is it?
Well, like a day to day life. But yeah, so you were about to talk about Septuagesima, which is excuse me, sept meaning 70, so Lent in Latin is called Quadragesima because it's 40 days before Easter. In the old calendar, in the East, in all the Eastern churches, as far as I know, there's a season called Septuagesima, which is pre-Lent. So it starts 70 days before Easter. So it's a time of preparation for Lent. But for some reason, that was taken out in the old calendar. Someone tell me why. I don't know. There's no good reason. But even like just a common people, observing days like, well, we just celebrated the Annunciation.
Right.
On March 25th. And then a week before that, St. Joseph, March 19th.
Like these feast days, these solemnities, how amazing would it be if we built a community around these feast days and had our heritage celebrated?
Right.
Because it gives us a common language, a common culture, customs, a community. That's what we long for as youth and as just human beings.
Communion with God. That's the main thing we long for.
Exactly.
And yes.
Yeah. Augustine, we have a God-shaped hole in our heart.
Yep.
So and I think tradition is really a longing for God because we have washed out God from the church.
Right. When we go to Mass, like I said, it's not just the Mass, but it starts with the Mass. When we go to Mass, it should be different from daily life. So that's why it doesn't work to play pop style music in Mass. That's why people like that, I think I would argue, who grow up on Life Teen and don't ever experience anything else, I think they leave the church because they realize, well, how is this any different than everyday life? Or when you have a priest who takes it upon himself to turn the Mass into his own monologue, where he it makes up stuff on the whim, like as if it's a lecture or a class, right? We don't want more of that.
Yeah.
We want something different. And the externals, including, the music, the liturgical vestments, the statuary, that all has an effect on our experience of the liturgy. And it's catechetical. It teaches us that, whoa, there's something different going on here. This is not just another random hour out of my week. This is the most important hour of my week. And the priesthood is one thing I want to talk about too. I think that, yes, exactly. You said transcendent. What we've seen in the last 50 years is a real attack on the priesthood.
Absolutely.
You can see that in priests who don't wear their clerics, who often say, well, I'm just a regular guy. Mm-hmm. I'm just like you laity.
Except he's not like us.
Right.
He has an indelible mark on his soul. He's ontologically changed, different.
Exactly. And they use that as an excuse to not hold themselves to a higher standard. And yes, they're not perfect because they are priests. In fact, I think it's harder to be moral as a priest. But the point is that they are held to a higher standard because they are a minister of the mysteries of God. And speaking of mysteries, the mystery of the faith was something that was also eschewed. So the traditional Latin Mass with many things, the Latin language, silence, and the priest facing east. So some people characterize as facing away from the people, but what I characterize as facing the same direction towards God, preserve the mystery.
Leading the people in prayer.
Exactly.
Instead of talking to the people.
All those things preserve the mystery of the faith that is so paramount. That the Novus Ordo kind of, well, here it is, and we're going to give you the bare bones so you know exactly what's going on.
Well, what I was telling you before we started recording was how this watered down Catholicism that we got as a youth, that was an inoculation to authentic Catholicism.
Explain.
So whenever we get this watered down faith, it's kind of like a vaccine. You get a vaccine. It's like I'm not a biologist by any means, but from my understanding, it's a weakened version of the virus. So whenever you get injected to your body, your white blood cells get stronger and learn how to defend itself against that virus. In the same way, giving us a watered down Catholicism, this happy clappy stuff.
It doesn't challenge us.
It doesn't challenge us at all. Yeah. In fact, you talk to most former Catholics and they'll say, oh yeah, I went to Catholic school my whole life. Oh yeah, I went to faith formation my whole life. I went to mass every Sunday. And then they left the faith. Why? And then nothing can convince them otherwise. The reason why that nothing can convince them otherwise is because they think they understand it. They think they have the fullness of it and reject it. But they don't. They don't have the fullness of it, and they haven't rejected authentic Catholicism. They have rejected this brand of Catholicism, this watered down Catholicism. That's what they have rejected. And so they're inoculated to authentic Catholicism with this watered down version of it.
Because what they got was for all practical purposes, except for the validity of the sacrament, Protestantism.
Yeah, absolutely. We've built our churches like Protestant churches.
There's an idea that something went wrong before Vatican II, and we had to restart everything and be more like the Protestants. At Vatican II, they had 6 Protestant theologians helping to create the Novus Ordo.
Really?
And I heard also that in the first edition of the Novus Ordo, which was engineered by Bugnini, Annibale Bugnini, there were no signs of the cross. And
really?
2/3 of the cardinals in the Sistine Chapel got up and left. They said, this is not Catholic.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's better, especially with the new translation we have since 2010. But man, pray that traditional mass. Right.
Absolutely.
We got to go.
Yeah. Pray the rosary every day.
Pray the rosary every day. But again, just remember, it's not just about the mass. It's about an entire way of life that orders you towards God.
All right. So let's conclude in prayer. But real quick, next week, I want to go over the post-synodal apostolic exhortation by Pope Francis on the youth.
Yep.
So we're going to read it over the next week, and then we'll talk about it next week.
Sounds good.
All right. So
let's teach our listeners the sign of the cross in Latin. Okay. So it's in
nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In nomine.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Saint Vincent Ferrer,
Pray for us.